You said something wrong about the church during the Middle Ages. That's why the Inquisition is after you now. They used a leather strap to tie to your neck a device that looked like two forks with sharp ends. One end of it was pressed against your chest while the other was resting against your chin. At first, you tried to lift your head to lessen the pain, but you couldn't keep it up for long. The so-called heretic's fork doesn't kill directly, but it tortures the victim with the slightest movement. However, according to scientific research on pain levels, it only scores 27 points out of 140. In this video, you will discover some of the most extreme forms of punishment in human history, so viewer discretion is advised. But before we begin, if you're new to our channel, make sure to subscribe so you'll always be updated with videos like this. You've probably experienced one of the less obvious types of harm in your life a few times already. Maybe the executioner just lacked patience while tickling you. In ancient China, what was called tickle torture was the main method of punishing members of the royal family who committed offenses. Because tickling doesn't leave any marks on the body and the victim recovers quickly, it became a popular method of torture, as long as the process doesn't go overboard. In European countries, on the other hand, they used goats as instruments of harm. The culprit is tied up while their feet are soaked with salty water so that the animal will lick them. What's so scary about that? That's because the human foot has a lot of nerve endings, and the goat's rough tongue is extremely irritating to them. After a few hours, the simple tickling becomes unbearable. It doesn't just cause laughter, but also painful muscle cramps. Gradually, you also lose control over your body, which leads to extreme stress, anxiety, and severe exhaustion. Aside from that, the nerve endings that respond to tickling are also responsible for sensing pain. That's why when tickling is done briefly and playfully, we only feel laughter and a light sensation. But when it lasts for several hours, the nervous system becomes overwhelmed, to the point that even a gentle touch can turn into almost unbearable pain. Now imagine that it's not your foot being tickled, but a more sensitive part of your body. In India, there's an interrogation method for criminals where they place a small insect on a sensitive part of the suspect's body and then cover it with a walnut shell so the insect can't escape. Because of the constant movement of the insect on such a sensitive part of the body, the torment quickly becomes unbearable. In the end, the executioners get any confession they want from the victim. Eventually, severe tickle torture can also lead to death. Because of asphyxiation or loss of air, when the victim experiences a throat spasm from uncontrollable laughter, it can also cause cardiac arrest or even a brain aneurysm due to extreme stress. But on the pain scale, tickle torture only scored 32 points because most of its suffering is psychological. This is almost the same as the next type of torture, the Chinese water torture. In this torture, the victim is first restrained so they can't move. Then, cold water is slowly dripped onto their face or head. Over time, the repeated drops of water make the skin and nervous system extremely sensitive. Because the person can't move and doesn't know when the next drop will fall, they gradually lose their sense of self. You've probably seen this in movies, but here's the strange part. There's no real evidence that it was actually used in China. This kind of torture was first mentioned by an Italian lawyer at the beginning of the 16th century. By the middle of the 18th century, German and French doctors even tried to use it as a cure for mental disorders. Aside from this, the term Chinese water torture became popular because of a trick by the legendary magician Harry Houdini. But does water drop torture really work? Because it looks harmless at first glance, some bloggers even tried it themselves. This was also tried by the show Mythbusters. All the participants knew they were safe and could be released at any time. But even so, the experience was still a nightmare for them. At first, they experienced cold, thirst, psychological tension, and physical discomfort. But as time went on, their whole bodies started to ache and they even had trouble breathing. This led to intense panic and desperate pleas to be released. But it gets even scarier. After the episode, the Mythbusters reportedly received an anonymous letter saying that Chinese water torture can cause mental problems that last up to 20 hours after the ordeal. That's why on the pain scale, it got 40 points. and there's still a big question about whether it was really used in real life. Eventually, Chinese water torture was replaced by an even more brutal form of water torture. One of these is called the Swedish drink. This name was invented by the Germans during the time of the 30 Years' War when they fell victim to soldiers, mercenaries, and marauders from the Swedish army. This is how this form of torture is done. Using a funnel, the perpetrators force the victim to drink a huge amount of the most disgusting and filthy liquids you can imagine. From urine and mud to feces, everything is poured down the victim's throat. The Swedes use this to force civilians to give up their money or food. Aside from the intense disgust and shame caused by the Swedish drink, the victims also contract deadly diseases. As their stomachs swell from the excessive amount of liquid being forced in, they experience severe pain. The perpetrators often worsen the harm by pressing wood against the victim's swollen stomach, or by inflicting injury with a stick. That's why on the pain scale, the Swedish drink scored 46 points out of a possible 140. Usually, some of these punishments started as public humiliation and intense discomfort, but ended in death with indescribable suffering. One of these hellish inventions is the Kang. The Cangue is a large board made up of two parts with a hole in the middle to fit around a person's neck. It isn't directly locked in place, so the victim has to carry its weight with their own hands while walking. To make the punishment even harsher, sometimes the person wearing it is chained so they can never sit down. The size and weight of the Cangue also change depending on the severity of the punishment. It can weigh from 9 to 15 kilos and come in different shapes: square, elongated, or extremely unbalanced. There are even times when its size is doubled or tripled. Often the cangue is so large that the victim can't even reach their own face to eat or drink. If no one helps them, they will slowly die of hunger and thirst. But the cangue is also used as a method of execution. The criminal is locked in a tall cage specifically made for this purpose. Afterwards, the cangue is attached to his neck and the support under his feet is removed. Because of this, he is slowly injured while hanging from the weight of the board. This was the method of execution in China until 1900. On the pain scale, the damage caused by the cangue reached 62 points. But even though it's that bad, it's still far from the cruelest thing ever conceived by man. During the Middle Ages in Europe, people became extremely creative when it came to causing harm. One of their inventions back then was called the Judas cradle. It was a sharp pyramid made of wood or metal, attached to a support stand with a special clamp on top. First, the victim's arms and legs are tied. Afterwards, the body is secured using a metal ring attached to the ceiling or wall with ropes. After this, the person is slowly seated on the sharp tip of the pyramid. There's no need to describe in detail how horrifying its effects are on the body because it's clear that it causes unbearable harm. The harm lasts even longer when the executioners want to extract a confession or information. When the victim remains silent, they add weights to their arms and legs so that the sharp edges of the pyramid dig even deeper into the body. And, as if that wasn't enough, the Judas cradle was never cleaned, so it became a breeding ground for deadly bacteria and infections. So even if some victims survived, they were often killed later on because of infection. And even if they survived, they carried the physical and psychological trauma of the torture for the rest of their lives. Because of this, the Judas cradle scored 79 points on the pain scale, which is more than halfway up the scale. But the first torture device to exceed 100 points on this list is the oblet. The oblet is a narrow horizontal passage or cell with only one opening at the top. It was often used as a dungeon. Because it was so cramped, prisoners usually couldn't even sit properly. Even worse, oblates were often built inside the castle itself, so that the victims could hear the voices of other people and smell food while they were imprisoned. This only made their mental suffering worse. But the real torture here is the fact that prisoners were literally forgotten inside these holes. They slowly died from thirst, hunger, exhaustion, and infection. Compared to this, execution using the Judas cradle almost seems like a quicker way to end the suffering. Oubliette is a form of live burial that has been practiced since ancient times in different parts of the world. In the Roman Empire, for example, the most powerful Vestal virgins who broke their vow to remain virgins were sentenced to death. But because it was forbidden by law to spill their blood, they were buried alive and left to die slowly and desperately. And if you think this kind of cruelty only happened in the past, you're mistaken. In Mongolia, it is said that this barbaric method of execution was still used until 1933. That's why, in its various versions, live burial scored 108 points on the pain scale. But what if you're not alone in that confined space? Another kind of nightmare awaits you, the rat torture. As early as the 1st century AD, there were stories about the cruel ruler Apur of Tivoli, who allegedly placed victims in a large barrel with hungry rats until they were slowly eaten alive. In India, criminals were made to wear loose pants tied at the ankles before rats were placed inside. Just imagine which part of the body suffers the most and how painful that is. But medieval torturers in Europe made it even worse. They would tie the victims so they couldn't move, then place a cage with no bottom on their stomach and fill it with rats. Then they would heat the top of the cage with burning coals. Because of the intense heat, the rats would desperately try to escape by gnawing at the metal cage. But when they realize there's soft flesh beneath them, that's when they start biting and digging into the victim's body to get out. Sometimes the cage is even placed on the victim's head, near the mouth or on other parts of the body. I'll leave it to your imagination to fill in the rest of the details. What's even more terrifying is that there are reports that rat torture was still being used in some South American countries up until the 1980s. Because of how extremely damaging it is, it scored 112 points on the pain scale. It seems like nothing could be worse than this. But before we get to the most terrifying torture methods that scored the maximum of 140 points, there are still 2 more horrifying inventions. The first of these is the rack. The rack was another deadly invention from the Middle Ages. It was a wooden frame with rollers on both ends. The victim's arms and legs were tied to it, and as the torturers turned the rollers, the body was gradually pulled in opposite directions. It causes indescribable pain due to the dislocation of joints, tearing of muscles and tendons, and in the most severe cases, even the bones break. The executioners could torture the victim for several hours or even days to force them to confess or give information. Sometimes, there was even a special person assigned to monitor the victim's condition to make sure they stayed alive and conscious until the appointed time. That's why often, just the threat of sending someone to the rack was enough to get the information they wanted. Because of the intense pain it caused, this torture received 116 points on the pain scale. But the ancient Greeks even managed to surpass the cruelty of medieval torturers in Europe by creating one of the most terrifying torture devices in history, the Brazen Bull. According to stories, it was made by an Athenian named Perillus as a commission for a Sicilian tyrant, Phalaris, in the 6th century BC. It was a hollow bronze statue shaped like a bull with a small hatch on its side. The person would be placed inside, the hatch would be closed, and then the torturers would light a fire under the belly of the bull. Even more terrifying, the structure of the statue's nose was designed so that the victim's screams would sound like the bellowing of a bull. And as if the barbarism wasn't enough, after the execution, the victim's bones were even used to make jewelry and sold in the markets. The inventor of this machine also quickly learned that it's dangerous to work with tyrants because the first person Phalaris tested in the Brazen Bull was Perillus himself. His skin was gradually damaged as it touched the hot metal. Afterwards, the extremely hot air slowly damaged his airway and lungs. It was as if he was being cooked alive, and before he suffocated or lost consciousness, Perillus endured pain that reached 130 points on the pain scale. But even as cruel as that was, it still can't be compared to what those sentenced to Lingchi experienced. Lingchi is one of the most barbaric punishments in the entire history of mankind, and it originated in Asia. It was used in China, Vietnam, and Korea until the early 20th century as a punishment for the most serious crimes such as murder and high treason, as well as against the personal enemies of the emperor. The victim would be tied to a post in front of many people to make the execution a public humiliation. Afterwards, the executioners would slowly cut small pieces of flesh from the victim's arms, legs, and chest. According to historical records, the victim could receive anywhere from 100 to 3,000 wounds during Lingchi. Because of this, it was also called death by 1,000 cuts. Experts say that with this kind of injury, a person would likely die within about 20 minutes. But sometimes, the victim's family would bribe the executioners to deliver a fatal wound right away to shorten the suffering. However, Lingchi did not only cause physical pain. For the Chinese back then, it was also a spiritual punishment. They believed that the destruction of the body would prevent a person from being whole and healthy in the afterlife. The use of this terrifying execution method was officially stopped in China only in 1905. That's why it's not surprising that Lingchi received the highest score on the pain scale at 140 points. I'm sharing all of this purely for educational purposes, and maybe to give you a little thrill. But I hope your experience while listening didn't reach the level of torture. If you enjoy intense stories and extreme sensations without putting yourself in danger, there are plenty more exciting videos you can watch on my channel.